Hello, everyone. This is Jessica Rackley from the National Governors Association, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes to join in, and then we'll start. Hello, everyone. This is Jessica Rackley from the National Governors Association, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the second webinar in a two-part series, mainly geared to new governors, energy advisors. And today's webinar, we're going to be covering state energy trends that we're seeing. So on today's webinar, I'm Jessica Rackley, Senior Policy Analyst here at NGA's Energy, Environment, and Transportation Division. I'm going to be talking about Governor's energy actions. And then we have an excellent lineup of panelists. We have Carl Linville from the Regulatory Assistance Project, known as RAP, and he's going to be covering Utility Commission energy trends. And then we have Christy Hartman from the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL, and she's going to be covering state legislative trends that NCSL has been tracking. So guidance for today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording link and the slides. They'll be posted on our website, and we'll send them out to you all after today's webinar. Feel free to share with colleagues that maybe missed today's webinar. And then we will have around 10 to 15 minutes towards the end of this webinar for Q&A. Please submit any questions in writing to me via the GoToWebinar control panel. You'll see a questions box there where you can type in questions. So just to provide a high-level picture, in the November 2018 elections, there are 22 new governors, and 17 incumbent governors were re-elected. And NGA is hosting a series of events for all the new energy policy advisors. So we are having these webinars, and then our main event is a boot camp for new energy advisors that's going to be taking place May 9th and 10th here in the Washington, D.C. Area and Arlington, Virginia. And NGA can provide travel support for one attendee per state, and it's geared to new advisors, so those that have been in the role for 12 months or less. So if you're interested in that boot camp, please feel free to reach out to me. My email is jrackley, R-A-C-K-L-E-Y, @nga.org. And then this slide just gives a high-level overview of our Energy, Environment, and Transportation Division and the types of projects we work on. So it ranges from power sector modernization to our water policy learning network, and we also do a fair amount of energy efficiency work, nuclear weapons waste work, resiliency, smarter states, and transportation modernization. And then I mentioned earlier our support for new governors, energy advisors. We're also going to be doing boot camps for transportation policy advisors and water policy advisors as well later in the year. And then on the energy side, we're going to be coming out with a governor's guide to energy policy sometime either late this summer or early this fall. So I'm going to be talking about recent governor's energy actions, so mainly, and the trends we're seeing, mainly either for executive order or announcements by governors that have taken place in the last 6 months or so. And I'm going to focus on 3 main areas, so climate, clean energy, and clean transportation. And then this slide actually goes over kind of some recent themes we're seeing in 2019 state addresses. So they range from either clean energy to workforce development, to Governor Gordon talking about carbon sequestration and faster permitting for oil and gas, and then Idaho talking about nuclear research. So these are the 3 topic areas I'll be covering today, as I mentioned earlier. So climate, clean energy, and then clean transportation actions that we've seen in the past 6 months to the past year. So one of the key trends we're seeing are a number of governors have taken climate-related actions, which are driving state energy policy. So wanted to definitely cover this because it's one of the main drivers. So a number of new governors recently announced that they're joining the U.S. Climate Alliance. There's now 23 governors that are part of this alliance, covering over 50% of the U.S. population. So I know that New Mexico, Michigan, Illinois, all of those new governors recently joined. Then we're also seeing Virginia and New Jersey have plans to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And then we've seen the recent announcement in the past couple of months of the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which are similar, mainly the same states that are also part of RGGI. These states have committed to working together in a new regional low-carbon transportation policy proposal that would cap and reduce carbon emissions from the combustion of transportation fuels and invest the proceeds from this program into low-carbon and more resilient transportation infrastructure. And I put just the timeline on the TCI policy design. They're moving really quickly. Hope that by this December, they'll be able to publicly release a proposal for how they're going to cap transportation emissions. And then we've also seen, and I know Christy, I think we'll talk about this a little bit more, but a recent New England governor's commitment to regional cooperation on energy issues. And that covers the topic area of existing nuclear generation and the value of nuclear to regional energy security and winter reliability, and also the value of existing nuclear to meeting those Northeast states' carbon goals as well. So regarding recent governor's announcements or executive orders on climate, Oregon Governor Kate Brown last fall came out with a climate agenda, which outlines recent legislative and executive actions, as well as plans to create an Oregon Climate Authority. Massachusetts Governor Baker He came out with a broader climate change strategy, and then that executive order also requires a follow-up comprehensive energy plan to be developed in the state. And then New Mexico, the governor recently issued an executive order that establishes a climate change task force and then has more broader climate objectives such as emission reduction targets, zero emission vehicle targets, building code standards, and renewable energy transmission corridor mandates. To go a little bit in depth on some other broader climate change related executive orders, North Carolina Governor Cooper came out with Executive Order 80 the end of last year. It has greenhouse gas reduction targets, also has targets for zero emission vehicles in the state, and then has lead by example targets, so energy reduction targets for state buildings. And then has as well requires the development of a North Carolina Clean Energy Plan. Pennsylvania, Governor Wolf at the start of this year also came out with a broad climate change related executive order. It creates the Governor's Green Government Council, has greenhouse gas reduction goals, sets out responsibilities for different state agencies with specific input on climate, and then also enshrines the Green Governor's Council in the state. And then one trend we're seeing, which is driven in part by the governor's recent climate-related announcements and executive orders, there's a number of specific clean energy actions. And states are setting very ambitious clean energy and carbon-free electricity goals and combining those with transportation electrification goals as well. And many states are going beyond renewable targets of 40 to 50% that were previously considered quite high, and are going up to 100% renewable, clean, or carbon-free generation targets. And then I wanted to outline some states in particular. There's 5 states with high volume renewable energy goals in place via legislation or a governor's executive order. Puerto Rico just passed legislation, which requires a 100% renewable energy goal. And then governors from close to a dozen other states have proposed or publicly committed to high volume clean energy, renewable energy, or carbon-free electricity. So involving clean energy actions, New Jersey, Minnesota, Maine, a number of states have similar goals, so 100% clean energy by 2050. New Mexico, the governor signed a 100% carbon-free energy bill into law just a few weeks ago. And then in New York, Governor Cuomo launched the Green New Deal, which is quite broad. It has a 100% renewable energy target, boosts the clean energy standard in the state, quadruples offshore wind, the wind target. It also has solar and energy storage targets as well, and then provides funding for renewable energy projects. Regarding what we're seeing in the clean transportation realm, a lot of states have come up with, a lot of governors have recently released executive orders regarding transportation electrification or autonomous vehicles. In Washington, the governor released an executive order that mandates the governing council shall ensure that each lease or purchase of a new vehicle in the state prioritizes battery electric technology. Colorado, I'm going to talk about that executive order, which is the first that Governor Paulus came out with, but it lays out a transportation electrification framework. Oregon, it requires state agencies to develop a plan and budget to install electric vehicle chargers. And then North Carolina, the broader climate executive order has a zero emission vehicle target, which is to reach 80,000 by 2025. To go in a little bit more detail, this is the first executive order that newly elected Governor Paulus came out with in January, and it creates a transportation electrification work group to develop strategies. it also requires state agencies to develop a rule to establish a Colorado zero emission vehicle program, and then invest money towards electrification, and has a zero emission vehicle and clean transportation plan that it mandates from state agencies. This slide just goes into some of the opportunities NGA has moving forward. As I mentioned earlier, the next main event is a new Governor's Energy Policy Advisors Boot Camp that we're having here May 9th and 10th. Our annual Energy Policy Institute is usually in June of every year. I think it's getting moved back to July. And then we have a Lead by Example workshop coming up late summer, and some grid modernizations retreats in the fall, along with some energy resilience and security work that we'll be doing. And that ends it for me. I'm going to hand things over to Carl Linville from the Regulatory Assistance Project. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Carl Linville from RAP, Regulatory Assistance Project. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give you a very quick background of myself. I'm an economist. I have a PhD in economics from North Carolina, and I taught economics at the Walton College of Business at the University of Arkansas for a number of years. Then I moved to Nevada during the electric restructuring time, where in 2000 I ended up becoming the energy advisor to Nevada Governor Kenny Gwinn, which happened to be during the Western electricity crisis period. So it was an interesting time to be sitting in the shoes that you all are sitting in now. I was also the director of the energy office while I was there. And then I was a commissioner in Nevada, and now I have two hats. One, I'm a principal at Regulatory Assistance Project, which is a NGO, non-advocacy NGO, nonpartisan. We come into states to help state officials only at their request, and we help them implement various, clean energy and carbon policies. We're currently working in the last year and this year. Some of the states we're working in include Oregon, North Carolina, Minnesota, Arkansas, and many northeastern states, and a handful of others. So I'm principal at RAP. I'm also happen to be, as a private citizen, I serve on the Energy and Balance Market governing body. So I interact with the states and the Western Interconnection in that capacity. Next slide, please. So being an energy advisor is a really great opportunity and honor, and so congratulations to all of you for your role, which may be new to you, or maybe you've been doing it for a while, but I really enjoyed my time doing that. I'm going to do two things in my presentation. I'm going to talk to you briefly about some electricity sector trends, some broad trends that are causing a lot of PUC activity, and then I'm going to talk about some of those PUC activities. Next slide, please. This graphic depicts the change in the cost of wind energy since 1980. You can see that the precipitous decline in wind reaches back into the 90s. The cost of wind has been low for some time, and the growth or the cost effectiveness of wind presents transmission challenges for many places, as wind is often remote from where people consume energy. So this drop in wind costs is interesting in its own right, but it's also interesting because it makes transmission and regional collaboration very important. Next slide, please. It's also true that solar costs have declined precipitously. The decline in solar costs has been much more recent. This chart actually obscures a little bit the very significant cost reduction that has happened since 2008. But the price of solar panels has gone down tremendously. The adoption of solar panels has increased tremendously. This keeps public utility commissions hopping for a few reasons. One would be renewable portfolio standards that go along with these wind and solar technology trends. Second would be the transmission implications of the grid scale additions of these renewable resources. A third would be the intermittent or variable nature of these resources, being dependent upon Mother Nature in telling us when the sun shines and when the wind blows, and which causes some changes in the way that the electric system is operated and the way that utilities keep the lights on and regional transmission organizations keep the lights on. So this trend of solar is also contributing to busy PUC activities on thinking about maintaining reliability, growing renewables to achieve carbon goals, to achieve renewable portfolio standard goals, and on a local level, on the distribution grid, the smaller voltage lines, also on managing electricity in those local areas where a lot of rooftop solar or solar that's less than, say, 100 kilowatts or so is appearing on the grid. Next slide, please. And this most recent trend is the, again, very dramatic drop in the price of batteries. This goes hand in hand also with the ability of the electric system to manage distributed energy resources and load control technologies like they are, batteries. So those two things are very helpful because of the variable or intermittent nature of wind and solar. So there's a lot of interest now in batteries. There's a lot of interest in using load control and batteries to help to balance electricity on the distribution system and things like that. So this is another very significant trend. Next slide, please. And the upshot of some of this is this graphic here shows the Xcel Energy recent solicitation by Xcel Energy for resource bids. You can see here on the left the coal and gas prices. These are coal and gas prices for existing power plants. So if you know electricity regulation very much, you know that the price of existing plants is lower because the rate base or the capital costs of that have been eaten away some. And also these plants were built a while ago, and inflation does its thing over time. So the costs of existing plants are really, can be quite low. What's dramatic here is that solar and wind energy resources, new resources, are coming in at costs that are very competitive against existing resources. So another trend that we're seeing that's driven by this event is that there's some early retirement of power plants going on. And you may have heard some talk about securitizing assets. Colorado is a place that has chosen to securitize some of these existing plant assets in order to ease the transition. So that's another hot issue, and just in general, dealing with retiring a fleet of plants that operate one way, replacing it with a fleet that includes the traditional technologies as well as these variable technologies, leads to a different kind of electric system. So those are our big trends, and now I'm going to go to what's going on in some different places. Next slide, please. So here's some critical state PUC activities. First of all, we hear so much talk about batteries, local resiliency, electric vehicles, solar. We hear so much talk about these things. Sometimes we forget to take note of the fact that the big grid is still relevant. Now, this graphic here depicts, how the grid worked since the 1940s. And really, the only way it worked since the 1940s up until about 15 years ago. But now over the last 15 years, when we have serious adoption of technologies on the distribution side and more local generation, this basic grid structure is changing. But we still first should take note of the fact that we still need transmission. Primarily, most of the transmission that's being built today helps us to integrate different variable energy technologies so that together they can produce a more balanced production portfolio. So transmission is still very important. Our traditional, the majority of our power still comes from our large decentralized power plants. So this basic grid is still very important, and public utility commissions are still spending a lot of time on these issues. Next slide, please. But at the same time, we have the contrast of decentralized resources growing. I guess I don't quite go with yesterday and tomorrow. I think it's both yesterday and tomorrow together are kind of the way things work going forward. But certainly the tomorrow part of this slide, the right-hand side, is where we're seeing a lot of increasing activity and public utility commissions spending a lot of time thinking about how to beneficially use these technologies on the distribution system. So this includes someday perhaps having vehicle to grid integration where vehicles can both be taking power from the grid and helping to supply power to the grid when it needs it. It includes integrated building electrification policies that again make the building both a consumer of resources as well as a producer of resources and services. So you're coming into your jobs, or you're in the middle of your jobs in a really, really exciting, dynamic time in the industry. Next slide, please. So what do we see going on in a number of places? Well, we see this broad moniker of distribution planning and grid modernization. And here are four of the big ticket items that we see discussions about in a number of states. One is hosting capacity analysis, which is looking at the distribution side of the system. How much solar can we accommodate? What are the impacts of putting all that electric vehicle charging out onto the distribution system? What can the system handle, and where do we need to make investments? Non-wires alternatives, we're traditionally thinking about when we come into congested situations on the distribution grid, that we need to upgrade a substation or reconductor lines and make them available to carry more electricity. Now we're seeing a lot of those distributed resources, these solar, batteries, and so forth, coming into play, demand response, to help obviate the need for some of those physical distribution system investments, or changing what is invested in. With variable energy, following Mother Nature, forecasting on a much shorter time frame, when we can do weather forecasting much better. This is particularly true for wind, but we can do weather forecasting much better on a shorter time frame rather than a longer time frame. So updating our forecasts and getting forecasts that are more granular in terms of what's going on in local places on the grid and in shorter periods of time is a big area that a lot of commissions are spending time on. And then finally, all of the advances in technology. I mean, one of the big trends that I didn't include in my trends slides, which I really should have, was the incredible advance in information technology, communications, and the ability to control power systems. And all these things together open the door for improving operations, for improving resiliency, for making possible things like microgrids. So it's, again, a very exciting time. Next slide, please. Another thing that you might hear about that's going on at public utility commissions is something called PBR, or performance-based regulation. This is not a strictly new thing. However, with many of the utilities' business opportunities now coming not from building traditional large-scale technologies like building a new large remote power plant, but coming more from making investments on the distribution side, making their distribution system platform much more easy to work with for all those customers that are doing things on the distribution system and so forth, is leading utility commissions to think about, are we compensating our utilities fairly? Are we setting prices the right way? Do we need to change how regulation is done a little bit? So these are places in the country where some kind of PBR initiative is currently under discussion. Next slide, please. This slide here, I talked about Texas a little bit earlier. This slide here, I won't break it down in detail because I don't want to overuse my time, but I'll just say that this slide basically shows a solar production profile, the blue, and 2 wind production profiles, one in West Texas and one in South Texas. And you can see that, and these resources are, typically located in different places. I mean, West Texas wind, South Texas wind, and then the solar tends to be, it can be in those places, but it can also be closer to where people live. So all of it needs to be bound together by transmission. And you see that by combining these resources together, there's a citation to the academic study from which this data came. You can see by combining these resources together, you get a production profile, which is actually pretty similar to how energy is consumed on a daily basis in the summer in Texas. So combining these resources together is really important. Next slide, please, which makes transmission really important. This slide here shows how much better, this is basically the amount of wind that needed to be curtailed before some key transmission was built. Once that key transmission was built, then all of a sudden, the wind could be beneficially used in many hours of the year, virtually all hours of the year. So again, transmission is still a big ticket issue at public utility commissions and regional organizations like ERCOT. Next slide, please. I guess that's all I had for you today. I look forward to our question and answer time. Thank you very much.
Well, I will jump right in. This is Christy Hartman with the National Conference of State Legislatures. Thank you to NGA for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Similar to NGA, NCSL, we're set up covering environment, energy, and transportation. And so I primarily work on energy issues, although certainly, things are more and more intertwined. And in my presentation today, I think we cover quite a few aspects in those different sectors. Next slide, please. So today, I just want to give a very quick outline of NCSL and the work that we do for state legislatures. I'll also, since we're coming out of the midterm elections, talk about party composition across state legislatures and sort of what that means for energy policy. The quick kind of role of state legislatures and what they do to set energy policies, and then really focus on some of the big legislative trends that we're seeing across the country. Next slide. So NCSL, we're a bipartisan organization. All legislators and legislative staff across the 50 states are members of our organization, and we really try to provide good bipartisan information to state legislators and staff on any topic of interest. Certainly in the energy sector, we stay really busy looking at a number of different topics, and those will be sort of the legislative trends that I talk about in just a minute. Next slide. So first, I know we're well underway post-elections, but I did wanted to quickly highlight, where we see state legislatures currently. So when compared to past midterms, the change of legislative partisan control in these last midterms were pretty modest. Fewer chambers flipped than normal. And so typically we really see the party of the president loses out in the midterms, but at least in the case of state legislatures, we didn't really see that big shift. Democrats definitely made gains, but the Republicans, I think, still continue to maintain a robust position in state legislatures. We're certainly closer to the 50-50 split by party across the country, but one of the things that really happened in this legislative cycle was that we lost kind of those divided chambers where there's a Republican majority in one chamber and a Democratic majority in the other. We've really kind of become more partisan across state legislatures. Typically, on average, 12 chambers change parties, and we've seen that kind of every midterm election cycle. And in this past midterms, we only saw 6 chambers switch parties, so it was pretty modest. But I think kind of looking at these kind of graph and charts, it's helpful to see, kind of helps direct what type of energy policies we see introduced in the state legislatures and then sort of what we see passed throughout the legislative session. So really looking at the role that state legislators play, I mean, I think everyone is very familiar with sort of the types of bills that are introduced that provide maybe tax incentives or some type of new funding opportunities to promote a policy or a specific technology. And then on the flip side, we also see state legislatures sort of mandating, authorizing, or restricting specific actions. But kind of more broadly, and I think what we see a lot more often, but maybe not as exciting, is we see bills introduced that really never have a chance of passing, but they're still introduced, maybe specifically because it's of interest to a state legislator or a constituent. But a lot of times it's to sort of signal support to the state, to a particular industry that the legislature kind of agrees or supports with a particular action. It also just initiates a dialogue on whatever topic. And so we see, there's much more bills introduced that are never passed, but they do start the conversation on different energy topics. And then finally, what is very common is the role of the state legislature to develop study committees to further look into specific issues. Next slide. So now I want to get into sort of the specific legislative trends that we're seeing across the country. And starting with grid modernization, it's certainly a very broad concept, but it has garnered a lot of interest from state legislators and other stakeholders over the past couple of years. Grid modernization can encompass everything from distributed energy resources to smart meters to innovative rate designs, have energy storage up there, microgrids, things that I can talk about more in just a minute. But in this case, we often see technology moving faster than the policy or the regulatory response, and I'd say that's certainly the case with grid modernization. State legislatures are still trying to figure out what role they should play when it comes to grid modernization. But we're seeing a lot of broad kind of initiatives. States are looking, maybe to provide funding or some type of policy framework, but still being general enough where they may allow utilities, to still decide kind of what investments make the most sense or would be most impactful to their customers. So there's almost every state has considered something related to grid modernization, but a couple kind of quick examples that we've seen most recently. Minnesota, over the last couple of years, has passed bills related to these concepts, and one bill in particular would require utilities to regularly issue reports that describe the transmission and distribution system modernization investments, and also allows utilities to recover costs for those investments. So basically needed sort of state legislative authority to do that. Virginia passed a bill in 2018 that directs the state regulators to consider new demand management practices and provides new rate adjustment options for a variety of modernization initiatives. That can be distribution system upgrades, smart meter deployment that we see a lot of states consider. So we're seeing a lot going on in this space, and we certainly anticipate this will be a continued interest for state legislatures. Next slide. So kind of related to grid modernization, going specifically into energy storage, I think that's a topic that state legislators have been interested in and asking at least NCSL for information on for a number of years. However, it's really this past, 2018 and now certainly into 2019, we're really seeing state legislatures introduce bills and actually get a number passed related to energy storage. So right now we only have 5 states that have energy storage targets passed by state legislatures, New Jersey becoming the 5th state last year. However, Nevada also, the legislature asked the PUC to establish targets. So we're seeing kind of more progress related to energy storage targets. Most commonly, I think related to energy storage, we see state legislatures considering bills that would either commission studies, to look at energy storage. They would fund demonstration projects. They may require that storage be part of the utility's sort of resource planning process. And those are just kind of generally, I put up a couple of the most recent bills that we've seen related to energy storage, but certainly expect this to be a topic that continues to grow across state legislatures. Next slide. So changing electricity markets, this has been one of those topics that has kind of been in the forefront for the last few years. So this isn't certainly a kind of 2019 issue, but state legislatures are introducing all types of policies, whether it's more specific to market structures or specific to nuclear and coal plants that are having a more difficult time competing in markets, supporting renewable policies, as we see, I know Carl mentioned, solar and wind costs going down, and we see sort of the increase in renewables across kind of electricity generation. Next slide. So I want to kind of talk specifically about nuclear power because that's where we've really seen the most state action relative to the discussions over changing electricity markets. So there's been a number of states that have considered some type of action to support at-risk nuclear plants. Nuclear has certainly struggled over the last few years, and at least from the nuclear industry, they have concerns over how electricity markets are designed and have kind of requested changes, and so far we've only seen state legislative policy action to address some of that. The most popular kind of support mechanism to help nuclear power has been through the zero emissions credits programs, and so the New York PSC was the first to kind of implement a policy change, shortly followed by Illinois, and most recently we've seen New Jersey pass a bill that looked to provide support for at-risk nuclear plants in these restructured states, but also at the same time provide more incentives for certain renewables. Most recently, and what we're closely following, Pennsylvania and Ohio have similar bills, so we'll see sort of if they take the same path as these other states and really focus on state policies and providing kind of financial support to at-risk nuclear plants. Next slide. I think related to this is kind of what we're seeing, and I think, it sounds like certainly from the governor's offices, we see sort of a similar trend focused on clean energy standards. So as I mentioned before, on any of those nuclear bills that passed, also the state legislature considered supports for renewable energy. We see, kind of huge momentum in this area. Renewable portfolio standards have been around for a long time, but we're at the point where a lot of those original measures, we're reaching the point where either states are meeting whatever goal they had set, or we're kind of at the deadline of the year that they had set. So we're seeing a lot of amendments or completely new legislation from states. One of the biggest trends is sort of expanding a state's RPS to include, to more broadly say, clean energy or carbon-free. Sometimes that means adding nuclear into the definition as well. We're also seeing a lot of states consider cap and trade or some type of carbon tax policy. It's been certainly something that's been discussed for a long time, but we're seeing it across more and more states. Whether or not those bills pass is sort of another issue. We haven't seen much so far, but certainly, we see I think last year was around 20 states, so both Democrat and Republican majority states kind of proposing at least some type of carbon pricing measure. As kind of similar with the governor's offices, you know, we've seen a number of states introduce these 100% renewables measures. Those seem to be gaining traction in a handful of states, and so I included those below, and obviously we're closely following those activities as well. Next slide. So cybersecurity continues to be sort of a big issue. I think what's different from some of the other legislative trends is that when it comes to cybersecurity, state legislators are still trying to figure out specifically what role they play, if any. And so there's most popular are kind of bills that look at creating some type of study committee or a council. And so we've seen quite a few states introduce some type of advisory council kind of looking at cybersecurity relative to critical energy infrastructure. And, you know, most states have something kind of in the works or already enacted relative to that. The other sort of area on cybersecurity where we see some state activity is just looking more at data privacy and sort of what type of information can be shared. Next slide. And sort of the last kind of topic that I just wanted to quickly mention is, I guess I could have said electric vehicles and infrastructure. You know, most states have some type of incentive for electric vehicle adoption in place, but really the trend that we've seen from state legislatures over the last couple legislative sessions relates to these new electric vehicle fees. So putting an annual fee on top of a normal registration fee on electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. So 20 states have these fees in place already. 3 states this 2019 legislative session have added to that. All of them were $200 per year for electric vehicles and $100 for hybrids. We expect this number to continue to grow, and really, you know, kind of 2 parts of this is that the fees vary widely. So, you know, some states like Colorado have a $50 fee. Other states are proposing these $200 fees. And really, from supporters of these new electric vehicle fees, it's trying to find ways to reach parity between drivers of traditional vehicles and those of electric vehicles, understanding that electric vehicles aren't really contributing as much now to the gas tax, and states are feeling the crunch of trying to find ways to pay for the maintenance of roads and transportation infrastructure. And so we'll see if this continues. You know, we certainly think that these fees will continue, but see if this sort of the reasoning behind it continues over the next few years. The other big questions, especially when it comes to electric vehicle infrastructure, is, you know, who owns the charging infrastructure? Can utilities be the owner? And sort of what are some of those implications and issues associated with that? And then, you know, say if a utility is the owner of the charging infrastructure, should it be regulated by the PUC, and how we should be going about that? So there's 10 to 15 states that have considered bills recently that try to sort out some of these questions, and this will certainly be a growing trend. And last slide. So there is my contact information if you have any questions. And I also just wanted to point out there's a few bullets at the bottom of the screen. One is we just completed a publication that looks at the legislative energy trends. So please feel free to take a look at that. We also have a full energy publications list on our website. Hopefully you can click on any of those links after the webinar if you're interested in that. We have a public legislative database so you can see the types of bills that are being introduced across state legislatures. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Christy and Carl, for the wonderful presentations. We're now going to go to Q&A. Just as a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them in via the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel.
Hello?
Jessica, this is Christy. It's gotten quiet on my end. Can you still hear us?
Likewise, this is Carl.
Can anyone hear us?
Yeah,
Yeah.
is it? Sorry, we are having some technical difficulties. Our computer shut down, so are reopening GoToWebinar.
So we should be all good to take questions now.
Okay. So Carl, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I was asking you a question earlier, I think when the computer shut down about, can you tell us a little bit more about your background? I know you mentioned that I think you used to be a governor's energy policy advisor, also was a PUC commissioner. Can you kind of provide some of your advice from, I guess, the governor's energy policy advisor's perspective and kind of tips to working with utility commissions?
Yeah, sure. I do think it's a little bit different in each state. I do think that taking advantage of NASEO, the National Association of State Energy Officials, and NARUC, National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and NGA and NCSL all together is a really good way of staying connected. There is an initiative right now between NASEO and NARUC looking at the future of electric system planning. So if you're a NASEO member, look into that. That'll be a good way of getting yourself connected to some of the things that commissioners are thinking about. In general, I think that energy offices and energy advisors to governors, have a lot freer ability to interact with stakeholders and the public than a commissioner does. Commissioner, you can't talk about what's going on in active proceedings. You have to, ensure that there's a good, fair judicial process going on there. So energy advisors can be really helpful by convening stakeholders, by pursuing things that can help to generate information that ends up being quite useful both to the legislatures and to their PUCs. So your ability to directly interact with the PUC may be limited by active proceedings, but your ability to be helpful to them by taking on issues that are important to the state and important to your legislature really can help to generate good information and good cross conversation with the PUC and its staff.
Thanks for that, Carl. And then a question to you for Christy and Carl as well. Kind of where do you see things headed in a few years? I know Carl talked about performance-based regulation, and Christy, you talked about different trends you're seeing. Do you all, let's say, in 4 years, see more of the same of that? Are there any kind of cutting edge, innovative type things that you're seeing that you think will expand more across all the states?
This is Christy. I mean, I certainly think kind of the grid modernization concepts, at least across state legislatures, will take a more prominent role. I think this is where we see kind of big changes coming. And so certainly for all policymakers and PUCs, I think that'll be kind of a big area.
Yeah, I would. This is Carl. I would agree with that. And these changes can't happen quickly because they're really fundamental. Kind of change. I mean, taking advantage of information communications technology in the electricity sector, while keeping track of cybersecurity, as Christy noted earlier, it is going to be very beneficial, but it's going to take, sustained effort over a good number of years. So I think that issue's going to be with us for a long time. And I think the activity that you see that Christy described of the different legislatures, that's giving some forward-looking direction to where they want states to go with energy. Again, that's going to take, it's going to take years and those plans go out years to achieve their goals. So I think those would be the two things that I would highlight.
And then I know, Christy, you talked about legislative support for existing nuclear. And I know that's been kind of a key topic area, especially with all these states that have, 100% clean energy type targets, that there's been increased kind of discussion of the importance of nuclear. Do you, Christy, from your opinion, see additional kind of state legislative action on supporting existing plus new nuclear, or kind of where do you see that headed?
I think, there's kind of two components. One is sort of these, certain markets, the restructured states that are having kind of nuclear plants with some difficulties. Certainly, I had mentioned Pennsylvania and Ohio have bills introduced this session. They have had bills introduced, the last couple of legislative sessions. Pennsylvania created a joint nuclear energy caucus several years ago. They've been trying to figure out something that would work for the state. I think if a bill is going to pass in either state, it's probably this year. And, I think as they've watched other states introduce these state policies and get them enacted, and having these bills being held up by the courts, I think has maybe given some legs to what's going on in both states. So, we'll kind of continue to monitor that. At the same time, I think state legislators are really interested in, whether it's market operators or FERC kind of taking action as well. From my discussions with state legislatures, it's not that the state policies are maybe the most preferred action, but it's sort of what we've seen to date to keep those existing nuclear plants going. But we're also seeing a huge push from state legislatures on that sort of future of nuclear, where we're headed. So there's a number of states that are looking at SMRs and new technologies. Washington State in particular has had a number of bills, also where NuScale is located in Oregon, so kind of close by. Washington State is looking at kind of opportunities to sort of support new nuclear technologies. Idaho, New Mexico, a number of states have sort of looked at whether, maybe the state legislature offering up some initial investments, whether that kind of pushes the industry and interest in new nuclear technologies in those states. And so far, all of this is just preliminary, and right now we're just seeing kind of state activity saying, hey, we support this concept, but could be kind of where we're headed across some of these states.
Thanks for that. And I know we only have about 1 minute left. So Carl and Christy, if you can just both summarize in maybe like 30 seconds or less, like a few key takeaways that you think that Governor's energy policy advisors should be thinking of moving forward. Kind of what are the top few trends and things they should consider? Okay, so quickly, I'm going to just say I think we covered the trends that I discussed. I think are pretty much the ones, the distribution planning, grid mod, performance-based regulation,
deployment of DER technologies. Those are things that are where you're going to see activity. That one thing that we didn't talk about that I thought about putting in my presentation and then forgot at the end was the increasing activity of cities in this space and the increasing need to integrate what's going on with cities and states. So I think there will be some activity there that we should be watching out for. Thanks. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Carl.
And just quickly adding to that, I would say, I think there's a real push from all of us kind of in groups, certainly NGA, NCSL, NARUC, NASIO, to sort of bring our members together and kind of to talk about similar issues and in a similar format. And so, kind of what I'm seeing is as more and more of these issues become intertwined and, the different policymakers are all trying to deal with these issues at the same time, being able to, build a good relationship with your counterparts and, kind of have a good understanding of the direction the state is headed on these different energy issues and all trying to work together, I think, certainly help create better energy policy and certainly something that we as the organizations supporting you all are trying to push as well.
Thanks, Christy. And thank you everyone for joining in. We've recorded this webinar. We'll be posting it on our website along with the slide deck. Please feel free to share. And just as one last plug, we have our new advisors boot camp May 9th and 10th here in Arlington, Virginia. So please let us know if you're interested in attending. Thank you again, Christy and Carl, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.